Welcome to the first in our expert series. I'm Deb Siverson with Xponents, and I'm honored today to welcome Craig Runde, who is the director of the Center for Conflict Dynamics at Eckerd College, where he oversees training and development on the Conflict Dynamics Profile Assessment Instrument. He's a frequent speaker and commentator on workplace conflict issues and serves as a feedback adjunct for the Center for Creative Leadership. Craig has his BA from Harvard University, an MLL from the University of Denver, and a JD from Duke University. He's practiced law in Colorado. He's taught at the University of Minnesota Law School and Wake Forest University. He's also co-authored several books with Tim Flanagan. He joins us today from his office in St. Petersburg, Florida. Welcome, Dr. Runde, and thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Deb, it's a pleasure being with you. I look forward to this conversation.
I wanted to start by telling our audience about your book, and I know you have several. I just recently downloaded Building Conflict Competent Teams, but the one that I have on my shelf, and that's the topic for this morning, is Becoming a Conflict Competent Leader. Tell me a bit about what prompted you to write this book.
It's very interesting that when we would talk to people in organizations who were involved, particularly involved with training, they had a great deal of challenge to get support for courses and training in the area of conflict, and frankly in all areas, but certainly in the area of conflict. And so we wanted to write a book that would be aimed at leaders, demonstrating to them the importance of not only generally supporting the training and improvement of capabilities for people managing conflict in their organizations, but also the importance of they themselves doing it. Mm-hmm. So that was the sort of the underpinnings of our first book.
Well, I know I mentioned to you earlier, I'm a huge fan, and it's made a profound difference for me. And I think about a lot of your concepts when I'm out working with teams and groups. I know that, in my opinion, the book really does answer the question, how can leaders assess how they currently handle conflict? And it helps them develop the skills that they need to deal with it more effectively. In the work that you've done, I want to start by just talking about what is conflict, because I think we both know people have a variety of opinions about what conflict is, what creates it, and then generally speaking, how effective are we at managing conflict at work?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. The people in the field tend to have two different kinds of definitions of conflict. And it is related to the underlying research going on about how conflict occurs and how it's managed. On the one hand, there are one set of definitions that look at conflict as something that is a problem. And usually those kind of definitions will describe it as situations in which people have differences or apparent differences and where they become upset or angry about them. Mm-hmm. So there's sort of a negative tone to it that has arisen. And that, frequently is indeed what happens in conflict. There is another kind of approach which emphasizes the same idea that there are differences that people have, or apparent differences. But in that second definition, it leaves out the connotation that people are necessarily angry at or upset. It really looks at it maybe earlier on, that the differences exist, and what happens as a result of those differences is really dependent on how people manage it. It could turn out favorably, it could turn out poorly, really depending on how people respond. So you have both of those, but I think in each instance, the essence of it is that people perceive that there are differences, and differences that matter to them. Early on, it becomes easy for them to be worried about that or concerned that there are these differences. And it's at that point where the question unfolds, okay, what are you going to do about it? And I think that in general, with respect to the part of your question dealing with how effective are we, most people are not very effective. It is a difficult thing because there's some emotional element to it, and people are generally not very comfortable dealing with emotional aspects of life, and certainly ones that involve a perception of a threat to your own interests. That's what people get concerned about. And usually what I find is that people tend to back off, pull back. So we'll ask people in programs frequently, how would you describe conflict? And most of the words that people use are negative, and they even describe them as negative. And then when we ask them, how do you generally deal with conflict, the dominant response is that we try to avoid it. And then we ask, well, how well does that work? And people laugh because they know that it really doesn't work.
Right.
So I think that people are, it's a vexing problem for people in general.
There's a couple things that come to my mind listening to you. One is that whole definition, if you will, and I think you said it, that really conflict is about differences that concern us, right? I mean, there's some way that those differences make us feel at risk in some way or at some level, cause us to become defensive and try to protect ourselves.
And I think it's partly because people don't know how to deal with it. Mm-hmm. We ask people in programs, how many people learned how to deal with conflict in school? Very few people raise their hands. How many people learned how at work? Very few. And, when you ask people, when did you first learn how to deal with conflict? They'll think for a moment, but almost always it comes back to some sort of incident in their early life in their family, and it's usually, involving their parents or siblings. And those people didn't know how to deal with conflict either. So your first sort of learning experience is from somebody who didn't know how to deal with it.
Yeah,
it's a very difficult thing.
I know that you mentioned earlier that oftentimes the what causes conflict to start to sort of show up is that we have some emotional attachment to it. And in the book, you talk about triggers. I'm curious about your view on the importance of recognizing triggers in ourselves and in others.
Yeah, we talk about this notion of triggers, or sometimes we call them hot buttons. Basically, people have values and ways in which they think other people, and frankly themselves, should behave in certain situations. And when they find somebody behaving in a way that offends those values, it's very easy for that to, in effect, trigger negative emotions. Your expectations are not met, you become upset, and at that moment, you're really in jeopardy of defaulting, in effect, into negative types of behaviors that can escalate the conflict. And so, knowing more about what triggers you, what upsets you in conflict situations, or what kind of behaviors in other people upset you when you encounter them, helps you not be caught off guard when it does happen, and so that you are more able to sort of manage yourself well. You still may not like what they're doing, and you can address that with them, but at least you'll address it in a more balanced way. You won't be upset and really unable to respond effectively.
What are some of the tips that you offer people to be able to, I'm going to say, slow down and ground themselves before they step into that conversation about what's maybe not working? Or
Well, I think the first thing is to recognize when something is pushing your buttons to start with. I mean, be aware when you're getting upset. And a lot of times people will recognize that there are certain sort of physical sensations that they'll feel. Some people feel butterflies in their stomach. Some people feel tension or a flush coming on, because these are indicative of physiological responses that are taking place. So kind of knowing that it's happening is helpful in the first place. And then there are various kind of techniques that people can use to be able to either slow things down, which may include taking a time out, gaining a little bit more time to compose yourself, and or using certain techniques that will actually physically help you relax and let some of the tension go. Various kinds of centering techniques, breathing techniques that can calm you down. Can be very helpful, and it's great to be able to work on those things before you ever encounter another conflict, because it's very hard to do these things in the heat of conflict if you haven't practiced them at times when it's not so hard. But once you get used to doing that, and conflict emerges, you're more able to calm yourself down and regain balance, which is a great first step, and prevents you really from doing things you wish you wouldn't. So many times people will say something that they later regret. Well, how much better to regain some composure first before something like that happens.
Mm-hmm. It's similar, isn't it, to the discussion in the book about choosing to take the high road or the low road, that choice point. Is this really what slowing down creates for us?
Absolutely. Basically, when people realize that something that is happening that's concerning them, there's some sort of difference with somebody that means something to them, it easily can trigger negative emotions, which can very quickly cause you to choose to react in ways that are ineffective. You can get angry and lash out at the other person, or you can pull back, because these are sort of fight or flight type of instincts, and they're very quick. And when your life is at threat, being able to have a quick response like that probably helps you. But the problem is that the same kind of mechanisms kick in when it's not a life-threatening problem, but rather it's you have a difference of opinion with somebody in the office, and running away or fighting doesn't really work so well. And so in those cases, being able to slow things down and manage your emotions allows you to be more able to consciously choose to engage the other person to find out what's going on and come up with solutions that will work for you and also for the other person. And that's really the key, being able to consciously make that choice rather than default into a negative response driven by your anger that is being caused by one of your buttons getting pushed.
I have to say that in the book, Becoming a Conflict Competent Leader, the knowledge that I gained around the behaviors, the constructive versus destructive, have been very valuable in exactly the situation you described. They fall on the continuum, I know, of active and passive in terms of our behaviors, but just knowing that sometimes you have to step back before you step in has been a real eye-opener for me personally.
That's terrific. It's always pleasant to hear that this, your work has helped someone in a meaningful way. And I think that this distinction between constructive and destructive behaviors, which has been described in different ways in the literature over time, and most recently by the authors of the conflict dynamics profile assessment that I work with, Doctors Mark Davis, Sal Capobianco, and Linda Krauss. The characterization of these behaviors as some behaviors, when you use them, the destructive ones, take you down the low road. In other words, when you use those types of behaviors, which include things like displaying anger, demeaning other people, retaliating, which are sort of the active behaviors, or the passive behaviors of avoiding the other person, giving in to the other person, those kind of behaviors will tend to escalate or prolong a conflict because they call forth from the other person similar kind of responses. It's almost like you get into this kind of a cycle where one person uses a destructive behavior, which stimulates a destructive behavior from another person, and around you go. There's a nice depiction of that by Dr. Dan Dana called the retaliatory cycle, where one destructive behavior begets another. And so you really get stuck in those kind of situations.
Mm-hmm.
If you can go ahead.
I was going to say, it's interesting that you say that. I know for myself, in some relationships, if in fact I'm not able to slow down and I respond in a destructive fashion, it's kind of, there's a common pattern there, like where I might go one direction, maybe I express or show my anger inappropriately, and then the other person might retreat. So sometimes those patterns, I think, must show up in relationships over and over.
It's almost like a dance of conflict. And the one you were describing, it's very much someone steps in, the other one steps back. Well, the one who stepped in steps in again. And then there's this like a one-direction kind of dance, so one person backing away from the other. Sometimes it's both step in, and it's kind of a head-to-head type of battle. And that's when the destructive behaviors are being used. It is also possible at that choice point to be able to consciously choose to use constructive behaviors. And these are behaviors that tend to enable a person to understand better where the other person is coming from, to share their own thoughts and feelings with the other person, to reach out to make sure that communications keep going, and then finally to begin to, once you've understood each other, come up with solutions that work for both of you. Those are some of the active behaviors. The passive constructive behaviors, things like reflective thinking, weighing the pros and cons of different approaches, and delay responding, being able to wait things out if tensions are running high, give yourself some time before moving forward. These kind of constructive behaviors will tend to help resolve the issues, lessen the tensions associated with conflict, and make it more possible to find solutions that are sustainable because, in fact, they work for you, but they also work for the other person at least well enough so that they agree to do it.
One of the great things about this work around becoming conflict competent is the way that it really normalizes for people that, one, conflict is a part of life, two, that there's a way that we all respond when we're not maybe at our best, and that it gives us hope that we can choose a different course, and then to understand some of those behaviors so that we can consciously pick what needs to be utilized in that moment. I mean, those are such important concepts for all of us. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, where do we start for people that maybe haven't thought through this? I mean, what's the first step in becoming more effective in terms of conflict?
One thing that I think is very helpful for people is to take a moment and reflect on their own attitudes toward conflict. People like to stay away from conflict, so they don't like to generally think about it or reflect on it, but I think it's helpful as a starting point to ask yourself the question, do I believe that conflict is going to happen in my life? And when I ask that question in group settings, almost everybody says, yeah. Then when we ask a question of, do you have any plan for dealing with it? The answer guaranteed is no, right? So you have this thing that's going to happen, and people don't have any way of approaching it. So I like the idea of being able to reflect on it, think about, what does it mean to you? How do you see conflict now, and how does that affect the way in which you respond to it? And are you responding to it in ways that are getting you outcomes that you like, that really feel good for you? If you are, well, great. Keep doing it. But if you're getting things that are not that great, if if the conflicts continue, if people are resistant to you, if relationships are souring, and particularly if communications are drying up, these are all signs that whatever you're doing right now is probably not that effective. If you decide that you want to get better, then I think that there are a variety of things that somebody can do. You certainly can read books, although reading books is probably not enough, because ultimately you need to change the way you respond to it. So you can take classes and you practice and things like that. But, in effect, becoming conflict competent is, sort of a full spectrum type of activity. It involves changing the way you think about conflict, so that's a sort of a cognitive function. Definitely it involves being able to manage your emotions better around conflict. And I think for a lot of people, that may be the key area. You're able to manage your emotions so that you're not as fearful of conflict, and that anger and feelings like that don't get the best of you. I mean, you can have them. They serve a valuable purpose, letting you know that something's going on in a way that you don't like. But being driven by them in terms of your behaviors, then that's where it becomes a problem. So being able to have a better emotional intelligence, in a sense, becomes, I think, key. And then being able to learn and practice constructive communications behaviors. These are things that can help you personally, and then whether in your family or in your workplace, if you can adopt what you were talking about before, in a sense, norms of how do we want to treat each other when we have these differences, because it's natural to have the differences, but how do we want to go about resolving them and treating each other as we resolve them? If you have a set of agreements for how you want to do that, it makes it easier then to actually do it. So those kind of areas, I think, if you can build those for yourself, cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and normative, then you're in a much better position to be able to deal with the inevitable conflicts that will come along in your life.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for the roadmap you've provided for us, not just this morning, but in the work that you're doing every day to help us become better equipped to manage conflict. Thank you for your time this morning, Craig. I really appreciate it.
A real pleasure talking to you, and I hope this is helpful for your listeners as well.